Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see you all. My name's Stephanie Pilat, and I'm the director of the Division of Architecture here at OU.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm Shane Connelly, and I'm the director of the Institute for Community and Society Transformation. Our first session this morning features 5 presentations that explore climate change, environmental justice, urban and rural resilience. First, we'll have Rachel Riley, the director of the Southern Impacts Climate Planning Program, who will provide us with an overview of climate change projections and impacts. She'll be followed by Simone Domingue, a postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of Geography and Environmental Sustainability. Dr. Domingue will connect discussions of resilience to social justice and equity. Next is Francesco Cianferrani, an assistant professor in architecture. Dr. Cianferrani will help us understand the role urban design and housing plays in envisioning a resilient future.
Our fourth presenter is Angela Zhang, an assistant professor in journalism and mass communication. Dr. Zhang will discuss community resilience perceptions. And we'll wrap up with Tom Muller, an assistant professor in geography and environmental sustainability, who will conclude our session this morning with a talk on rural America. Rachel, would you like to get us started? Oh, do I need to switch this?
Welcome, everyone. It's great to be here this morning, and I was tasked to start off this day to talk about climate change and its implications for the U.S. and also Oklahoma. So it's a tall order to do this in 20 minutes, but I'm going to do my best. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Southern Climate Impacts Planning Program, or SCIP, we're a multi-institutional, NOAA-funded, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration-funded program led by OU, as well as involving other institutions around the region. And we cover the 4-state region of Oklahoma, Arkansas, Texas, and Louisiana. So the focus of today's symposium is related to migration and habitation, and I found it ironic that a few days ago I came across this headline talking about a small but growing number of Americans who you might consider to be climate migrants who are searching for other places to live that aren't quite as hazardous as their current locations. And this is something that about a decade ago was talked about by climate scientists and others, but it was still kind of a theoretical thing at that point. But in recent years, we're starting to see some of this issue actually happening. In its most recent report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said that it is indisputable that human activities are causing climate change and making extreme climate events, including heat waves, heavy rainfall, and droughts, more frequent and severe. So as you all know, and you'll hear more today, of course, this is an issue that is really important and something that we need to take action on. But first, let's start with some of the basics. What is the difference between weather and climate? So weather is the state of the atmosphere at a particular time and place, mainly with respect to human activities. Climate is more complex. There's multiple definitions depending on the spatial and temporal scales that you're dealing with, but one definition is the average of the weather conditions over a period of time relative to the departure from the average. In general, weather determines operations, whereas climate determines planning and design, or at least it should be affected by planning and design, but we could actually do a better job of accounting for climate in the planning and design of our infrastructure, which many of you in the room can hopefully help with. So there's different factors that determine our climate. We have what's called the Earth-atmosphere energy balance, and I don't have time to talk about all the details, but essentially it is describing how the incoming radiation from the sun is absorbed on Earth, reflected, absorbed into clouds, etc., and kind of moves about. And different places on the Earth have received different amounts of radiation depending on if you're closer to the equator or closer to the poles. The Earth's revolution and tilt is also a factor, as well as rotation, the latitude where you live, your elevation, and then there's a difference between land and water and how they deal with the energy. So land heats up and cools down more quickly than water. Other natural factors include solar variability. So there's about a 10-year cycle that the sun goes through that produces minimum and maximum solar output. But overall, it's not a giant factor in the climate that we experience. Also, ocean circulations affect what the climate is above in the air masses above. On very long time scales, tectonics, moving the continents around and forming mountains, it changed, where a location's climate is. And then we also have atmospheric gases, such as volcanic emissions, that for large eruptions will send particulate matter into the upper atmosphere that can have a temporary cooling effect, as occurred with Mount Pinatubo in 1991. So there are several different greenhouse gases, and we need our atmosphere in order to survive on Earth. But carbon dioxide is one of those greenhouse gases that it is present naturally, but because of human activities, we are increasing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And this is a problem because it lasts a long time. So it's either absorbed into our oceans and our land, or it stays in the atmosphere for thousands of years. Another greenhouse gas that isn't talked about quite as much, but is also one to be aware of and potentially concerned about, is methane. So methane doesn't last as long as carbon dioxide, but its warming potential is much, much greater than CO2. So here's a graph of carbon dioxide over the last 800,000 years. And most of these measurements are based on proxies or ice cores. So that's the blue, it's not showing up very well on there. But the blue squiggly line is the ice core data. So what it's showing is, until very recently, the carbon dioxide concentration was variable from about 170 parts per million to about 300 parts per million. But recently, it has gone way up. Again, it's you can't see it very well on this screen, but in the year 2020, the average concentration was 412.5 parts per million. So this is much higher than any period in the last 800,000 years. Now, what climate scientists are able to do is take into account the carbon dioxide and apply it to their models. So this graph is showing the black line is the observed temperature, change in global surface temperature from 1850 to the year 2020. And then what they'll do is they model, climate scientists will model what the temperature would be without any human factors, so without carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that humans are affecting. And you get the blue squiggly line. But when they add in the carbon dioxide and other human factors into the model, which is represented by the light tan color, that more closely aligns with the actual observation. So that's how we know that it is indeed, CO2 and other greenhouse gases that we're adding to the atmosphere that are affecting the temperature. So there's a lot going on these graphs, but the point I want to make is that climate scientists and modelers will then, take their models and project out into the future of what's going to happen based on the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. So, if we keep going business as usual and keep increasing at the rate we've been, the temperature will just rise even greater. The green line is showing that what would happen if we drastically cut our carbon emissions. And even with drastically cutting them, there's still going to be a little bit of a rise in temperature. So this is essentially showing that the choices we make and what we do with carbon can affect the temperature in the future. So let's drill down a little bit closer to home and look at the United States and what's going on with climate in the U.S. recently. So these maps are showing temperature trends comparing a recent 40-year period to 1901 to 1960. And the one on top is showing annual temperature changes. And as you can see, much of the U.S. has warmed, but at least as of 2016, which is the latest that this map is showing, there was still this kind of what we call a warming hole in the southeast U.S., which has since been determined to be likely due to reforestation that occurred in the southeast U.S. You can also see that temperatures have warmed more in the winter. And in the summer, there's been much warming in the western U.S., but some of the central and eastern U.S. actually had cooled over at that period. So what are their projections? The map on the left is showing projected change in number of days above 90 degrees by mid-21st century, so about the year 2050. And you can see that depending on where you are on the map, anywhere from 10 to over 70 more days over 90 degrees per year. So that's going to, of course, impact our cooling demands and energy systems. The map on the right is showing the projected change in number of days below 32 degrees or freezing. And again, it's showing fewer days below freezing per year. This map is showing trends in precipitation for annual amounts. So there's lots of different ways to look at precipitation patterns, and this is just one of them. So it's comparing, again, the recent 40-year period relative to 1901 to 1960. The western U.S. had, a little bit of a variability with some areas drying, some areas getting wetter. The central U.S. and the northeast had a wet trend of increasing precipitation. So a lot of times, the interest is what's going to happen with extreme rainfall and the heavier events that cause, flooding and, wash out roads and bridges and potentially are life-threatening. One way to look at that is the projected change in daily 20-year extreme events. So these are the values where in 24-hour period, it's based on the statistics, it's currently considered a 20-year event. So for reference, I put on the right side a couple of cities of what the current 20-year events are. So for Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, for example, that's 3.7 inches in 24 hours. In Oklahoma City, it's about 6.25 inches. New Orleans, which is very wet, theirs is about 10 inches in 24 hours. So these maps are showing mid-centuries on the left and late centuries on the right, the percent increase in those 20-year extremes. So take, for example, the Oklahoma City value of 6.25 inches, and then add 13% to that, and that would be the new 20-year extreme. So all in all, the heavy rainfall and extreme precipitation is getting more intense and projected to continue to get more intense. Drought is another hazard we deal with, and it's a natural part of our climate overall. There's different kinds of drought, including meteorological, agricultural, and hydrological. And as of the 2017 Climate Science Special Report, which is part of the National Climate Assessment, for those who have heard of that, the 1930s Dust Bowl era remained the drought of record for the U.S. in terms of geographic scale and duration. Now, the western U.S., as some of you may be aware, has been in a significant drought for many years now, and recently there was some research done that came out and said it's the worst in 1,200 years, at least for that region. And they also attributed about 1/5 of the drought to human-caused climate change. So we'll see in this next update that's coming in a year or so, what the latest will be on assessing kind of the drought record for the U.S. So something that we don't deal with in Oklahoma, but is very important in the western U.S., is snowpack, and because they get their water supply from melting snow in many instances. So these images are showing what's called snow water equivalent, but you can think of it as snowpack. The historical average is on the far left, the mid-century projection is in the middle, and the end of the century is on the right. So the story is that the snowpack is decreasing, the snow is melting sooner in the season, and which is leading to more evaporation and decreased water supplies. And you have, of course, population growth that is also increasing the demand on the water supply. Another problem that is especially dealt with out west, but again in Oklahoma, we see our wildfire days as well, our wildfires. And the frequency of the fires is not necessarily increasing, but when they do occur, they are larger and burning more. So that's the problem. And as you can see, this graph is showing the damages caused by wildfires in the U.S. These account for large fires between 1984 and 2018. And the fire situation is complex because there's definitely climate stressors involved, but you also have the built environment where people have moved and built in places that are historically fire prone, and that's part of the natural ecosystem. And also historical forest management practices led to an overgrowth of fuels, and so that's also contributing to when the fires do start, they're burning hotter. And then a secondary impact of wildfires is poor air quality, which is a growing problem. One area that's often of interest in our region is severe storms and what's going on with severe storms. So some recent research looked at the number of days per year that somewhere in the U.S. had at least one tornado, and that has actually decreased in recent decades. But what has increased is the number of days per year where there's been tornado outbreaks. So the projection is that that trend will possibly continue, so maybe not necessarily more tornadoes overall, but more outbreak days. And then even if we don't get more tornadoes overall, we still have population increases and the built environment and more infrastructure in harm's way, which is going to lead to increased damages. A hazard that we don't deal with in our region, but is important because so many people live along the coast, is flood or high tide flooding. And this has become an increasing issue. The graph on the left is showing between 1920 and 2020 the high tide flood days per year. So that is drastically increasing. And sea level rise is also increasing due to climate change, with the oceans absorbing more heat and expanding. And then our final hazard is hurricanes and tropical storms. So the graph on the left is showing the continental U.S. landfalling hurricanes between 1900 and, I believe, 2017. And there's not really been an overall trend in the frequency. It's slightly downward on the graph, but it's not statistically significant. However, the proportion that are intense are expected the proportion that are intense are expected to increase, and we're already seeing some of that. So let's drill down into Oklahoma very briefly. And I'm going to show I have two slides with these very brief statements. If you're interested in a little bit more details and the full citations, I encourage you to check out the Simple Planning Tool for Oklahoma Climate Hazards on SCIP's website, where it goes into some more detail about this. So for hail and damaging wind, The projection is for potentially increase in severity and frequency, but there's currently low confidence in that, and there's a lot of data limitations when assessing trends. For tornadoes, as I mentioned, the projection is for potentially an increase in tornado outbreak days, but not necessarily more tornadoes overall. There's also been some work done by Gensini and Brooks looking at a possible slight eastward shift in Tornado Alley, or the places that receives the most tornadoes. So there's a little bit of a trend with that, but we're still going to see tornadoes in Oklahoma. Lightning has limited data. There's a projected increase in lightning, but low confidence in that projection. For cold extremes, overall we're expecting warmer winters with 10 to 30 fewer days below 32 degrees by mid-century. However, that doesn't mean that we can't get extreme cold events. For those of you who are around, last February 2021, we had a very extreme cold event hit our region and was very costly. And so we need to make sure that we don't forget about those events that can still happen. As far as warming or heat extremes, most of Oklahoma's warming has occurred in the winter and the spring. And by mid-century, the projection is for about an additional 20 to 27 more days in the upper 90s every year. Heavy rainfall is something we deal with a lot. The projection is for an increase in the frequency and intensity of heavy rain events, and there's high confidence in that. And a lot of the built environment, can affect how stormwater drains and flows, and so that's something to think about. Snow is likely decrease overall, but possibly greater accumulations. For freezing rain, there's significant uncertainty and a lot of data limitations, so that's a really challenging one. And then drought and wildfire. Drought, it's, again, a natural part of our climate, but higher temperatures will increase evaporation, which can exacerbate conditions. And then I want to briefly mention, I didn't have time to go into these today, but our colleagues at the South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center produce climate projection maps that are tailored to our region. So if you're interested in wanting some more kind of maps and for models that are that do better with our region's climate, head to their website, southcentralclimate.org/resources. And then my last slide is a brief mention of some of the work that Skip does. I didn't have time to get into today, but we do a lot of stakeholder engagement, co-production with practitioners, and a range of disciplines are involved with from physical sciences and social sciences, among others. So thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for having me, to the organizers. I'm really excited and honored to be here with you all. I'm going to talk about centering social justice while planning for our climate future. So to get started, I just want to give a roadmap of my discussion today. I'm briefly going to discuss the connection between climate change and social justice, and I'm going to ground this in a case study of coastal climate adaptation in Louisiana, and this is based on my research, and I'm going to talk about some findings and implications. I'm also going to present community narratives of some of the folks that are experiencing the negative impacts of climate change, and I do this to really elevate their voices. And I am going to conclude with some thoughts for continuing research and dialogue that hopefully we can have today. So as we all know, climate change is creating a very uncertain future for communities. And our responses as a society, including planning for resilience and implementing climate adaptation projects, can actually reproduce inequalities. There's an extensive literature on this subject. Suffice it to say that our standard planning practices often prioritize privileged interests, even elite interests. The discourse of resiliency can obscure complex social realities, power relations, and obscure the root causes of climate change and other social disasters. So climate change and justice, or really injustice, refers to the structural inequalities in how environmental harms, goods, and risks are allocated, along with disparities in access to political power, resources, and opportunities. And this is connected in our society to long histories of dispossession, violence, marginalizations, things that have come with imperialism, colonialism, and slavery. And this particularly impacts communities of color, indigenous people, people living in poverty, and other people without equal access to rights, such as undocumented people, incarcerated people, people that are unhoused. And so in terms of climate change, this means that those who are most vulnerable to extreme and severe weather events or other impacts are also have the most at stake and have few resources for adaptation. I'm going to jump into a case study of what's happening in coastal Louisiana. In coastal Louisiana is facing a land loss crisis. This is in part due to the fact that the Mississippi River has been leveed, and so there's a loss of sediment that replenishes coastal wetlands. There's also a long history of industrial extraction and other industrial activities that cause coastal erosion, the erosion of wetlands. This includes the digging of canals to lay pipes. The figure above shows all of the different pipelines that intersect coastal Louisiana, bringing oil and gas resources from offshore to inland processing facilities. There's also oil and gas wells, which are depicted in the figure below. And this process of withdrawing fluid from and other resources from the ground causes soil compaction, causing subsidence. In the coming decades and really years, the number one issue, though, is going to be sea level rise from climate change. This is going to exacerbate land loss, and it's going to result in really catastrophic risk for coastal communities from tropical storms and hurricanes. And there are coastal communities that are in these areas that are stained with red and purple, and these are folks living here that will be displaced or face really extreme risks. Louisiana's coast is also racially, ethnically, and culturally diverse. There are Native American, Black, Southeast Asian, Hispanic, and Cajun or French Canadian people living in these coastal communities. For these people, their culture, religion, livelihoods are all based in the coast and its coastal resources. People have also weathered past disruptions and disasters because of the support that they get from their close-knit communities and social capital accessible through their social networks. A common thread, too, that runs through all these communities is that they have histories of traumatic dysphoria, violence, dispossession. For example, there are Native American tribes that are not recognized by the federal government or the state government, and they really tie their ancestry back to displacement. They sought refuge in the remote coastal bayous and have lived on those lands where they held the land as a public common resource until the state of Louisiana sold that land to wealthy landowners and oil and gas companies that then caused a lot of environmental degradation on those lands. There are people from Southeast Asia that were fleeing violence and imperialism after the Vietnam War. There are Black and African American communities that were established during Reconstruction, and also Hispanic and, like I said, Cajun folks as well. For these people, the loss of land is an existential crisis to their identities. There is a history of this dispossession that makes access to land very important, and also autonomy and being able to have the agency to make decisions about how they relocate is very important. For the tribal communities, being able to relocate and preserve their cultural heritage is very important as they try and get recognition as tribes. The state of Louisiana is addressing the land loss crisis, and this is an important case because Louisiana has really been heralded as an exemplar when it comes to climate adaptation in terms of using sophisticated models of future events. But the state is putting a lot of its energy, resources, and monetary investments in these large infrastructural projects, and there are some very serious issues with these infrastructural projects. The projects are basically gated openings in the Mississippi River that are designed to deposit sediment into surrounding wetlands to build back land. And the idea is that this will build land and it will also create a buffer from tropical storms and hurricanes and severe flooding events for communities and cities like New Orleans. But these structures will also increase flood risk for these coastal communities that are downstream of the diversions, which are highlighted with the red arrows. And they're also going to alter fish and wildlife habitat, such as oyster grounds and shrimping grounds. And these are resources that coastal communities base their livelihoods on. There are other critiques of the state's response, including that these large projects, while building land, do not actually reverse land loss over a long period of time. There will be a period when sea level rise will outpace the land that these diversions can build. There's also really limited funding for community-level adaptation, for things like structural improvements to houses, buyouts, etc. And then there's a political economic critique as well, meaning that these types of infrastructure projects actually benefit entrenched interests, political economic elites in the state. Part of this is that the response doesn't compel oil and gas companies for remediating past damages, like from the canals that they've dug. The plan also doesn't mention anthropogenic climate change as a major driver of land loss. And infrastructural projects will safeguard industrial assets, and symbolically, this could serve as a license for the state to continue with harmful extractive activities. So a research goal that I had in exploring this topic is understanding social processes that contribute to these continued injustices. My research is qualitative. It's based in ethnographic fieldwork and interviewing document collection. And I talked to people across sectors, people involved with these large-scale infrastructure projects, other climate adaptation projects and coastal restoration, as well as community leaders in coastal areas. So I talked from people from government, academia, nonprofits, private sector, etc. And what I found is that there's a cultural impulse to normalize environmental disasters and climate change as an inevitable result of fossil fuel extraction. And then there are also larger social macro processes that necessitate the prioritization of climate adaptation projects, such as constrained funding resources. And for these reasons, there is an emphasis on engineered projects that, quote unquote, get the most bang for your buck. And this is why there's such an emphasis on building these large-scale projects, because they are predicted to build the most land until the year 2050, which is rapidly approaching. But because of this emphasis of prioritization, the real concerns of vulnerable coastal communities are often discursively rationalized away. They're framed as unfortunate trade-offs for a greater good. And I have some examples here. So for example, Amber, a state agency employee told me that we understand that these projects like the sediment diversions will disrupt people's way of life, but it's for a bigger picture. Similarly, Mary, who works for a restoration nonprofit that supports the diversions, said that there's going to be harm for folks, and that's important, but there's a bigger picture of what needs to happen in the long term in coastal Louisiana if any of us want to keep living here. Robert, who worked for the same restoration nonprofit that supports diversions, became critical of them after seeing how community concerns were, quote unquote, steamrolled under the banner of resilience, meaning that people said that coastal folks are resilient and will adapt, but this was a way of dismissing their concerns. Danny, a coastal resident and leader, told me that he's tired of being resilient. He's tired of being told to be resilient, meaning that the existential threats that his community are facing pale in comparison to the response and the resources that he feels his community is getting. Communities could also be framed as irrational by supporters of diversions and other institutional actors, meaning that there were concerned that people were not acting in their best interest if they felt that they wanted to stay in their communities or that if they didn't support certain projects. But what I found from community leaders is that their narratives, their feelings about staying or leaving are much more complex. For example, Bobby said this about his community, and I'm sorry it's a long quote, but I think it's a really important narrative. He told me that the reality of our situation here is that honestly, we probably have about 2 more generations of people that can live in the coastal areas. And that's really heartbreaking to come to terms with. And there are some people who have and some who have not and won't. But I think more and more people understand that we have gone past the turning point, past the place where we can fix it. We're not fixing it. And so it's about living here as successfully as we can for as long as we can, and embracing the fact that that will not be forever. And there is something beautiful about that. It's like the difference between getting live flowers and plastic flowers for your birthday or something, or Valentine's Day. You sort of treasure those flowers and how beautiful and fragile and delicate they are, where the plastic flowers might go in a box and collect dust somewhere and end up in a garage sale. But I think that coming to that mindset of cherish it because it's beautiful and will go away, we have to celebrate that. And this brings up this idea that for coastal communities, what they want is the ability to have dignity and autonomy and agency in decisions about moving, relocating, etc. Donna, a tribal leader, told me that her philosophy and her people's philosophy all boils down to love. It's what you are doing does not have love for everyone, and that is all relations. That's the plants, the animals, the people. If you're going to impact those, then you really should not be doing it. And there are other ways to restore the coast based on our traditional knowledge that could actually work and end up having little to no negative impact whatsoever. And that's definitely because of the way we function as a people. You bring harm to none. And this brings up this important point that for communities like Donna's, they have innovative solutions. They have ideas about how to restore the coast, and these have also been supported by ample empirical research. Things like backfilling the oil and gas canals are a timely, cost-efficient way to be able to preserve their cultural heritage and buy them time for that dignified relocation. And so this gets to one of my last points, that as a community, we need to engage in research about power and politics, because communities in some levels are tired of being engaged without solutions being implemented. They have them, but there are political barriers, and that is it for my presentation. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm excited to be here with you in person. I thank you all for this opportunity. This morning, I want to frame my talk with a series of questions which I hope will help explore the potential of urban design culture for climate change and migration. My talk today basically wants to investigate how current urban growth models play a role in climate change, and I want to share with you some urban design and housing ideas which I believe need to be considered for the future. So I hope my talk will suggest some possible connections among our disciplines. So the first question is, where do we anticipate climate migration for the next decades in the US? I want to share with you this map published by the journal PLOS ONE. This map shows predicted migration patterns in the US counties, imagining a sea level rise of 1.8 meters by 2100. This map shows one possible migration model among the hundreds of studies that are currently available. I wanted to show this map at the beginning of my presentation for two reasons. First, this map provides an overall idea of where geographers are thinking domestic climate migrants will go by the end of the century. And second, it provides a great idea of the magnitude, the size of the phenomenon that we will face. Studies on domestic migration predict that climate change will lead to a dramatic redistribution as people will choose to live in regions less touched by extreme climate. According to some of these studies, 13 million Americans could move by the end of the century. 13 million Americans moving is an equivalent of 4 dust bowls in terms of people displaced. The US population is expected to grow dramatically, especially in central and southern states, which today we know they are among the most consumptive, high-carbon regions in the world. So this scenario sets a problem, but also an opportunity for the future of American mid-sized cities. So how is the built environment contributing to climate change? How do cities and towns, like the ones we have in Oklahoma, contribute to energy use and emissions? The most recent IPCC reports identify urban form as a key factor for global energy and carbon emissions. In the built environment, buildings and construction sectors are the largest sources of global emissions. As of 2018, the building and construction sector was estimated to have contributed roughly 40% of energy-related CO2 emissions globally. Housing alone accounted for 17% of those emissions. Besides industrial and agricultural sectors, there is also another critical factor which contributes to emissions, and we know this is transportation. So we know that transportation and housing are strongly related in the built environment. This slide helps us understand how means of transportation, specifically cars, contribute to CO2 emissions in our cities. This is a very famous image produced 20 years ago by the Center for Neighbor Technology, and it shows CO2 generated by cars in the Chicago metro region. Since its first publication, this map has become a sort of manifesto, a manifesto for generations of urban designers focused on smart growth and new urbanism. On typical carbon maps, areas with the greatest amount of carbon emissions are shown in red, and those with the least carbon emissions are shown in blue. Basically, the hotter the color, the greater the emissions. And as you can see in the left map, overall, urban cores produce higher amounts of emissions compared to suburban neighbors once we calculate them per square mile. However, research suggests that central urban areas produce lower levels of emissions per capita compared to peripheral neighbors. The key difference is that dwelling units and city blocks tend to be smaller in central cores, and cleaner transportation modes such as biking and walking are more diffused. So, if we consider all these aspects, in the US, the average urban household generates 1/3 of the carbon footprint of the suburban one. So a big problem that we still need to face here is sprawl, which is still a pillar of American social organization. I want to share with you some thoughts on sprawl. because current data are showing that suburban developments are still happening everywhere in the United States, in peripheral areas, in metropolitan areas of Dallas, as well in Denver, Salt Lake City. We know that the climate-related problems caused by sprawl come down to two main factors: monofunctional, unwalkable residential area, and the private vehicular transportation network they necessitate. So in this slide, I'm showing you a map of Oklahoma City. These thick gray lines that you can see here, I hope you can see them. These are the main highways and arterials, and in white you see built-up areas, in gray you have parks and green spaces. One important data that I want to share with you about Oklahoma City is that based on a 2019 city report, in Oklahoma City, roughly 100,000 acres of land area are impervious surface. That means that roughly 1/5 of Oklahoma City land area is covered by non-permeable, water-resistant surfaces, such as asphalt, concrete, and roofs. And another interesting data we have from the Oklahoma City ADAPT report is that 4% of total Oklahoma City square mile area is parking. To help us understand how much is 4% of the Oklahoma City area, I made this juxtaposed map. So 4% of Oklahoma City territory corresponds to roughly 24 square miles, which is more or less the area of New York City, Manhattan. These two juxtaposed maps show you how large is Oklahoma City once compared to Manhattan. But it also shows you that all the parking area in Oklahoma City is large enough to cover the whole Manhattan. So based on some quick calculation, all this available parking area corresponds to more than 1.9 million parking spots if we just use parking standards. And this corresponds to 3 parking spots per Oklahoma City residents. So here, clearly, there's a chance and opportunity for a more resilient future. Imagine if we start adopting some massive parking retrofit policies that convert parking into something more socially urgent, such as housing. So the previous slides have shown you how important it is to rediscuss the typical urban growth models in American cities if we really want to face the problem of climate migrations. The primary thing to consider, the most impactful one, is we need to focus on where and how to build for this migration push. With the coming climate exodus, how can urban design be a useful tool to plan for a climate migration? What urban design models can help us mitigate climate and build new communities? So for the future, more than ever, we need urban models and housing that can retain social capital in existing migrating communities and can also generate new social capital. Studies show that individuals' ability to activate their social capital is a key resource for coping with crisis. The question of social capital is particularly critical for migrating communities, we know that. So the quality of the social space where people live cannot be overlooked, and the importance of social contact in an urban environment cannot be overlooked. Of course, being in a time of great climatic transformation, traditional compact city models must be updated to generate renewed, climate-resilient urban forms. That means reducing waste heat and greenhouse gas emissions through integration of energy efficiency, transit, and walkability. That means more jobs or other attractions reachable within a reasonable travel time. But it also means modifying form and layout of buildings and neighborhoods to maximize solar exposure and natural ventilation. We need to use heat-resistant construction materials and reflective surface coating to reduce heat in cities. And also, we need to increase vegetative cover, as trees and green spaces play a significant role in sequestering carbon and cooling down air. And of course, we need to focus on housing, an housing type that allows us to achieve a minimum density that can support urbanity. 75% of buildings in our cities are housing. So the primary thing to consider, the most impactful one in our city, is how we build housing. So let's introduce the housing topic by discussing the current housing stock. On the left of this slide, you see three icons that represent the most diffused building types in Oklahoma. As you can see from these graphics on the right, the most common building types in Oklahoma are detached single-family housing, mobile home, and mid and high-rise apartments. Detached single-family housing makes 70% of the entire housing supply in Oklahoma. This is a low-density type, usually characterized by high operational energy. It has low embodied energy, but it is mainly built in wood framing. But we know it generates sprawl. Second place, we have mobile home and boats. Here in Oklahoma, 9%. This building type is a low-density type characterized by high operational energy and low embodied energy. Third place, mid and high-rise apartment, which summed together, they make 9% of the housing stock. Mid and high-rise buildings potentially produce high densities, walkable communities, and need less operational energy per household. But we know they possess high embodied energy because they are usually built with concrete or steel. So for low-rise multifamily types, such as row houses, triplexes, duplexes, fourplexes, we have pretty low percentages here. So we are not building housing in the middle range of the spectrum, and we are not building it right now because of cultural, legal, and economic constraints. However, in a resilient city, all ranges of density and a variety of building types are necessary. Indeed, residential models for climate-resilient communities need to be characterized by a range of density and neighborhood layout. Each one of them necessary for serving different market needs and integrated with different forms of renewable energy. So over the past few years, a series of urban design and national symposia, as well as research studies and design competition, have given more and more attention to missing housing scale in urban design, often called missing middle housing from Daniel Parolek's books, or low-rise multifamily housing, low-rise mid-density housing. This residential model has the potential to offer more flexible solutions for the growing demand of housing. These low-middle density housing models are compact enough to achieve a residential density that can support stores and transit. They are characterized by a limited height, no more usually than 2-3 stories, that can really fit the scale of lots of our neighbors. And they're also characterized by small-scale apartment, no more than 6 to 800 square feet. They are usually characterized by shared open green spaces at the ground level, which help with microclimate control and help build social capital. Also, similar to single family, they have a good amount of horizontal roof surface to host solar panel infrastructure. Another advantage of this compact low-rise solution is that they are relatively easy to build. So when you build low-rise, you can build with local materials, and also due to their low-tech nature, this project can experiment incremental housing solutions. So if we build compact but low-rise, maybe we can try for the future to experiment residential models open enough at the ground level to leave room for nature. For example, we can create patios or shared courtyards where to grow food, exercise. And an example of this approach is this, just for an example, I wanted to provide a couple of slides here at the end of my presentation. This 58-unit infill affordable housing development for veterans in New Orleans, recently completed by OJT office. Although quite compact, this series of duplexes creates a porous green neighborhood with shared spaces that increase access to natural light and landscape. And here is another picture of this low-rise project. And another opportunity provided by these projects is to explore options for partial prefabrication and incremental development. I want to show you this final project, a winning proposal for a design competition that asks interdisciplinary groups to create housing solutions for densifying Los Angeles suburbs in the light of change and urban growth scenarios. So for this project, this research team opted for designing a shared utility core between two dwelling units that combine the plumbing, HVAC, and other mechanical components into a single structure. So in this way, the most complex modules of the house, such as bathrooms, such as kitchens, can be assembled off-site to minimize costs and save time. And once installed on-site, different types of units in light frame construction can be built all around this central prefabricated core. And this is a rendering of this project, looking from a shared courtyard towards the street. And this is my final image. It's an image that helps me conclude my talk and reinforce the idea that for a resilient city, the dimension of the open spaces and the street is fundamental. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. Very excited to be here and present my research. My name is Angela John. I'm an assistant professor in the Gaylord College of Journalism and Mass Communication. And the title of my talk is Agency, Trust, and the Road to Recovery. So I'll be sharing some of my research in terms of looking at the social and psychological infrastructure for resilience, essentially perceptions of resilience and community resilience. So the symposium organizers had asked each of the presenters to talk a little bit about the current field of research in relation to climate change. And truthfully, the reality is my field in public relations, we were kind of complicit in some of the issues that we're still experiencing in terms of resistance to climate change idea in the public opinion. And this is really an ugly truth, and so public relations were the front for a lot of the fossil fuel industries about 40 years ago to manipulate and to change public opinion, and a lot of the communication messages were created then to change public opinion about climate change and to seek more favorable policies for the big fossil companies. However, there is a really drastic change for the field nowadays that we are increasingly recognizing that within the field, both professional and academia, that there is an ethical obligation to the community, to the stakeholders, and not just to the corporate interests. So my area of research is in the intersection of mass communication, public relations, and crisis and risk communication. And from just me seeing in academia and in the industry, there is a very shift of focus to focus more on the obligation, the ethical obligation side. And a lot of the research questions that my field, so mass communication, risk communication, and public relations is addressing are questions on topics like how do we communicate about climate change, migration, habitation issues, and how do we shape and reshape and studying what are some of the strategies that we can reshape public opinion regarding climate change risks. And also, how do we increase public's risk awareness, perceptions, engagement behaviors, and to take collective action? And finally, a final area of research is, and this is my area of research, is how do we increase and cultivate community resilience perceptions. So just as an example, some of the current research in mass communication, we look at how we can frame and communicate about climate change to change public opinion as well as to prompt public engagement or self-protective behaviors. So some of the research here summarized here found that actually if you talk about climate change from the public health perspective, is going to only increase engagement among liberal Democrats. So this is really politically divided topic. However, it's not going to change for any conservatives or Republicans. However, this is based on a meta-analysis of a lot of studies that if you use the message frame of framing climate change issue as an environmental issue, economic issue, or moral issue, So essentially, there is a right or wrong, and as well as this is going to affect people's economic interests. These have small or medium impact on individuals' engagement with climate change. However, I think the first research was done in 2018 after the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, public health frames might, I don't know what the research now, but I think that might change in terms of how to communicate about climate change through public health frame. So my work specifically focuses on the social and psychological infrastructure for resilience. And I specifically look at community resilience perceptions. So essentially, individuals' beliefs in their community's ability to overcome and to recover from adversity events or in risk and crisis. So any kind of events like pandemic, disasters. And this resilience perceptions is consisted of two components. One is trust in the community, so not just trust in the community leaders, but also trust in each other, trust in peers, both your in-groups and out-groups in the society. And the other factor is community members' perceived preparedness and perceived likelihood of community recovery. And so community resilience perceptions, a lot of times we talk about disaster, pandemic, risk, or crisis. We focus really on the physical infrastructure. But the social and psychological infrastructure for resilience is just as important. Just to take the COVID-19 pandemic, the recent pandemic, as an example, the U.S., right before the pandemic, the U.S. was ranked #1 in terms of global health index, in terms of the ability to care for and to respond to a big pandemic, global pandemic. In terms of the number of hospital beds, in terms of the number of health resources. However, our death toll from the pandemic is still ranked top in the world. And it really is contingent and boils down to this resilience perception in terms of what is really in people's mind, essentially boiling down to trust in each other and trust in government. So I think that the social and psychological infrastructure for resilience in terms of what people are thinking is just as equally as important as physical infrastructure. So most of my research, I study social psychology and how to communicate based on what people think. How do you communicate to them? And these are some of the theories that I use. Cognitive appraisal, extended parallel process model, which is a health communication theory, social capital, social amplification of risk framework. I'm going to talk about each of them with examples. So most of my research is quantitative in nature. This one research that I am going to talk about is based on this increasing phenomenon that people are trying to resort to social media to cope with adversity events in their life, crisis, risk, and in this case, hurricane disasters. And so I use cognitive appraisal theory, which helps us explain when people are overwhelmed by adversity events, how do they cope with either behavioral or cognitive strategies. And in this study, I found that people actually, we operationalized and we defined coping, social media engagement as coping strategies. So people may be going onto social media to take actions, to help others, to give out information to others in their community. They may be seeking social or instrumental support online. They may be seeking information online. And also they may be in avoidance and in denial and not really engaging. And so we are essentially looking at all of these factors and how they might help people cope with a crisis, disaster crisis. So we did a survey immediately after Hurricane Matthew in 2016, and we surveyed people in 4 affected states, coastal states. And we did a survey, and we used a quota sample that matched the state's demographic, people in the demographic people's demographic in the 4 states in terms of age, gender, ethnicity, and race. Sample size was 596, and we found that social media engagement behaviors are very central to increasing and changing community resilience perceptions. As well as we found that some of the other really important factors are crisis efficacy and community identification in terms of how people would cope with negative and positive, cope with negative emotions, and how positive emotions might lead to community resilience perceptions. So some of the takeaways from this one piece of research is that increasing crisis efficacy, so people's belief in themselves to take actions, as well as a precursor, which is the community identification, how cohesive the community is, are very important antecedents to community resilience perceptions. And we also found that action taking is one of the most important ways of how to increase agency and to leading to other coping behaviors. So action taking essentially is just very simple helping behaviors, helping others, giving out information that can really give people a sense of normalcy and really taking control over their own life when they are kind of appraising their situation and environment to be really overwhelming, stressful, and anxious. So that's some of the key takeaways. So following that study, we did another study to look at social media engagement and social capital, and how online and offline social capital and how that might affect community resilience perception in the pandemic. And we actually use social capital literature and to look at the differences between bonding and bridging social capital. And I don't really think the lines are very clearly laid out here. But we did 2 waves of survey. One wave was at the beginning of the pandemic, again used a quota sample. So this was in March 2020 when the pandemic in the US had just barely started. And another second wave of the survey was conducted in June 2020, which was about 3 months into the pandemic, about the first wave of the pandemic when it really hit hard. So the result was we found that at the beginning of the pandemic, all of the social capital, so bonding and bridging, and online and offline social capital were all connected with perceived community resilience, which is based on previous literature, what previous literature have predicted. So essentially, bonding social capital is your immediate family, immediate neighbor, so essentially people with the same social group within your same racial or ethnic groups. Bridging social capital is people outside of your immediate environment. And the result was that in the first wave, all of them were significantly associated with community resilience perception. However, in the second wave of survey, we found that only social media or online bonding social capital was related with perceived community resilience through directly and through social media engagement. So some of the key takeaways from this study is that social media really plays a very huge role in building and maintaining crucial interpersonal relationships and perceived resilience, especially when offline relationships are disrupted and when, especially during pandemic, face-to-face contacts are considered threats. And there also is a really interesting finding is that bonding social capital play a much larger role than bridging social capital in increasing community resilience perceptions. And I think this probably speaks to the problem of distrust of bridging social capital, so essentially distrust in bridging relationships, and especially online. So I think it speaks to the importance of developing trust, not just within one's environment, but within one's community, but also external of one's community. Since this is actually a really different result from previous disaster research, that shows that actually bridging social capital is actually very, very important for community recovery, because you need essentially knowledge and resources and information from people outside of your own community. So I thought this is a really interesting finding in terms of it kind of reflects what people are thinking most recently during the pandemic. And the last study, I'm going to really go through it really fast, is to look at how risks are shared on social media. So I used the social amplification of risk framework. We looked at what are some of the trust factors that affect people's risk perceptions and risk-sharing behaviors. Again, this is a survey. And just some of the highlights from this research is that we found trust in CDC is the only only factor that positively contributed to knowledge about coronavirus. Trust in local, where state health department, were actually negatively related. So it means that it's really, really important to message about risk consistently at local, national, and international levels, making sure that we're not really confusing and having any contradictory risk information. And another implication is that we need to have really open and transparent communication, and so that the scientific community can really educate the public about the risk from the very beginning. So just really summarizing everything, I think trust and agency are two primary drivers of community resilience perceptions, and that we need to rethink and define what constitutes community for people. It's not just geographical, physically based, but also socially mediated. And last but not least, community messages needs to be consistent and transparent. And thank you very much.
All right, thank you for having me. Today, I'm Tom Miller. I'm going to be talking about well-being and in rural America, trends, challenges, and opportunities. So does the clicker work? Great. All right, so for some background, rural America has long been known to have persistent and unique challenges relative to urban regions of the United States. Okay, so in rural America, there's a history of elevated poverty relative to urban areas, higher mortality, persistent outmigration, an aging population where we have a much larger share of individuals kind of out of working age. And this also contributes to shrinking tax bases where there are fewer young people, there are fewer working people. And it has persistently had this high level of inequality relative to urban America. Interestingly, urban America has actually caught up at this point, but the line of inequality for rural America has always been higher. And we've also had this history of industrial and corporate manipulation that while urban America has had this as well, it's been particularly severe for a lot of rural communities that have been really dominated by single sectors. However, I want to say from the beginning, rural America is also a diverse set of areas. It's not monolithic. It is ethnically, racially, economically diverse. It varies considerably by region, and there are many different levels of rurality, right? It's not the kind of one thing you might think of when it pops into your head, which for most people tends to be small, white, dominated towns. That's not what all of rural America looks like. However, what's interesting and what often gets missed is that the persistence and worsening of many of the factors of rural America are actually a reflection of rural success. You have to remember that rural places have historically become urban. And what has happened is the most successful, growing, and kind of economically active rural areas are the ones most likely to move out of rural categories and into urban. And so this chart shows this as it relates to mortality. So what you can see is that this lower line is those that were always urban, and then these are the ones that were reclassified each decade. And basically, the counties in America that were rural the whole time were the ones that always had the highest mortality rates. And so what you can really see is you just kind of see this further residual group of the kind of most struggling counties are the ones that remain rural. And the other ones that actually have success or develop just get moved over into urban. That said, the places which still remain rural in 2022 face considerable challenges. Poverty is still high. Almost all persistent poverty counties in the United States, so that's counties with more than 20% of their population in poverty for over 30 years, almost all of those are rural. And there remains a dependence on natural resource extraction in many places, which, given the relevance of climate to today's symposium, is something to think about. And just transitions towards more climate neutral sectors remains difficult. Infrastructure is aging and simply lacking in a lot of areas. And now in rural America, there are more deaths than births, largely, right? So what we're seeing is what demographers call natural decrease. Absent migration, the population is just shrinking on its own. And with the 2020 census, for the first time, we're really seeing actual true rural depopulation. It's historically been held steady through migration. This is no longer the case. So I'm going to do a case study today before I pose some kind of questions for thought, focusing on my work on household water in rural America. And to begin, many households in the U.S. face water hardship. I'm going to be talking about two dimensions. So one is access to complete plumbing, which is access to hot and cold water, sink with a faucet, and a bath or shower. Historically, it also included a toilet, but the census took that off the questionnaire for reasons we don't know. There's also poor water quality, so that's unsafe drinking water or wastewater pollution. And most people, probably in this room as well, presume that residents of the U.S. live with close to universal access to water. And this is generally true, right? So the UN estimates that about 99.2% of our population has continuous access to water, but that still leaves 0.8% of the U.S. population. That's 2.6 plus million people. That's greater than the population of Houston that do not have continuous access to potable water in the United States. So what we have is we have a situation where the relative number is quite low. You can probably draw similarities of this to COVID and risk, right? But the absolute number affected is actually quite high. But what this ultimately means is that the issue ends up being pretty invisible. And there is a growing body of work documenting this issue. So our water infrastructure is often given a D or D minus by the civil engineers. I think they actually upgraded us to a C minus this year. And it's estimated that 1.4 to 2 million people have incomplete plumbing access, and that number is not counting anyone who's currently experiencing homelessness. This issue is unevenly distributed across space and society. People of color face a disproportionate impact of regulatory burdens, and low-income and non-white populations, particularly indigenous populations on reservations, are far more likely to have incomplete plumbing. So this is from a paper we have in Nature Communications where we're talking about kind of characterizing the issue. So 0.41% of households, a little under 500,000, have incomplete plumbing in the U.S. 2.4% of our community water systems are in serious violation. And 3.37% of Clean Water Act permittees in the 47 states and territories where the data isn't completely unreliable from the EPA also are in significant noncompliance. So this is a lot of people affected. We then characterize this and look at it by what we call elevated levels of the issue. The goal right now from the UN for Sustainable Development Goals is that everyone, all people, have access to water, right? So we said if more than 1 out of 100 households, water systems, or permittees are in violation or don't have plumbing, that's an elevated level of the issue, especially for a country like the US that likes to tout itself as being, better. So what we did is we kind of dichotomized this, and what we find is about 16% of counties have elevated levels of incomplete plumbing. Almost 20% have elevated levels of community water system violations, and 64% have elevated levels of Clean Water Act violations, so that's wastewater. So this is a lot of people who either are affected or their neighbors are affected. Lots of people live in communities where their neighbors may or may not have access to water, and that's not a thing that people like to talk about, right? There's certainly a stigma around it. So here's a map. I'm just going to show incomplete plumbing for time. But what you can see is there is a lot of regional clustering that happens, but it is pretty well spread out. So it's really prevalent as an issue in Alaska and Puerto Rico, but also in the Texas borderlands, the Southwest, parts of the Midwest, the Mississippi Delta, but really also just kind of all over there are pockets, right? So this is a widespread issue. So this and a couple others I'm going to show here are what are called coefficient plots. So basically what we're showing is kind of the correlation between the issue and the outcome, right? And how we can interpret this is that this red line represents zero effect. These are little dots are the point estimates, and then these tails are the confidence intervals. And the easy way to interpret this is if this tail is crossing the zero, there's not a significant effect. If it's not crossing, there is. So what we can see for incomplete plumbing is that elevated levels of incomplete plumbing are more common in areas that are older, have lower income, higher poverty, greater populations that are indigenous, less education, and more rural. Okay? So there's obvious signs of kind of social injustice as it comes to incomplete plumbing. When we move to water quality, it's far less clear. So for safe drinking water, we find that there's this odd kind of mixed effect where it's more common in higher income but also higher poverty places. And then there's also an urban effect. And similarly for clean water, we find not a lot going on in the social dimensions besides the fact that it's actually more common in more educated places, and there's an urban effect. So what we see here is that incomplete plumbing is a rural issue, but poor water quality tends to be an urban issue. However, there's a huge caveat. The EPA simply doesn't regulate well water or septic systems, right? So that data is just not included. So we know well water tends to not pass the sniff test. Far fewer even pass actual quality tests, right? And so this is a huge issue that we just don't have data on, and we really have no idea what the scope of this is. Some states collect the data, but we just don't have domestic well water data, and we really don't even know how bad the issue is. But what about the future? So we have other work that kind of is building on this, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So although we do have weak water infrastructure in rural America, right, it's reaching the end of its life, it's crumbling, it's struggling, there's a reason we have an infrastructure bill. Investing in water infrastructure can actually pay dividends, right? It's kind of a necessary capital to catalyze rural community development. And what we find, and this is some ongoing work right now, is that when county areas, so all municipal governments and the county government, spend more of their budget on water infrastructure, they see returns about 8 years down the line. So we see, after 8 years, we see reductions in poverty, we see increases in per capita income, no real effect on inequality, and then decreases in unemployment, right? But these do take time to develop. This isn't an instant thing. However, it's important to point out that all of these things are plagued by issues of social injustice and structural racism, right? So it varies on the outcome, but I'm just showing one example here with poverty. So this is kind of an interactional model of what I showed before, but looking at percent Latino and percent non-Latino black. And what you can see is the poverty reducing effect of increasing the spending on water infrastructure in rural areas completely goes away as it becomes a more and more Latino rural community. And there are a lot of rural Latino communities, and they're growing. And so this shows that not everyone can capitalize in the same way, and this isn't anything to do with people being Latino. This has everything to do with structural racism in the U.S., right? What's interesting, though, and this might have to do with the establishment of black rural communities in the U.S. and how long they have been around, particularly in the South, is that we actually see as the percent black goes up, they're able to get more of a poverty reduction as they invest in water infrastructure. So what do we do? What do we do generally about water infrastructure, or really just rural issues overall? Unfortunately, I think a lot of social scientists and certainly sociologists will tell you we've known what we could do and need to do to improve rural well-being for a long time. We have to spend money, we have to provide oversight, we have to be intentional regarding equity, and we have to be really intentional. The new infrastructure bill can start to help with this, but I think there are definitely going to be some issues that are baked into that, especially we know that things that are administered through block grants have historically been wildly misused, right? And I think an amount of that is going to be block grants. But the point I want to make here, thank you, the one point I want to make is that although we know what we need to do, that's kind of a silly way to say that, because what we really need to do is overcome political will, inertia, disagreements about what actually works from people who haven't actually looked at the research, right? That's the stuff we aren't really able to do. But I want to pose some broader questions with the time I have left. So I've been thinking about this lately in some various work, and there's this question of what does a sustainable rural America actually look like under capitalism, right? As I was saying, a lot of rural places have become urban, and a lot of the rural development advice basically tells rural places to stop being rural. Basically, the way that a rural place develops, the way it improves itself, is it becomes urban. Can we actually sustain rural areas under our political and economic structure? In various interviews, I've often been asked, well, why should we try and stop rural towns from disappearing? Like, why do we care? And this is ultimately a question of values. If you value a place as being as a rural place, as being the kind of place we want around, and you want to support those who already live in rural places to stay there, then that's your answer. You don't need anything else. But if you would rather markets sort it out and kind of let unfettered development continue, then the end run of that is just that rural America basically ceases to exist. It's also important to point out that many rural places are full of culture and opportunity, but also many are places people don't want to stay, and they want to leave. And a big subtext of this is racial. When people imagine rural America, they tend to think of it as being the kind of white, romantic version of that. And so that's what they think they're saving, and there's a really strong racially coded message whenever people say we need to save rural America. However, rural America is very diverse, it's increasingly so, and this is really regionally concentrated, and it is also very interacted with lots of other dimensions of hardship in the U.S. So there aren't great answers to this. The only real way to support rural areas without turning them urban seems to me to be that we need to separate where people live, basically from how they make their money, if you could think of it that way. That's kind of the only way to do it, especially if we want rural places to actually stay rural. So things like universal basic income, supportive infrastructure and institutions, regardless of market considerations. Rural places just don't have the tax base and money to actually fix their water systems. So we basically have to help them out if we value those places. And then also the development of real well-paying remote work opportunities so people can live where they want, although again, this will select on elites. And we could end up with kind of a more European rural model where they're really just places where rich people live. So the next 30 years, I'm not saying that's all of Europe, but there's certain European countries. The next 30 years will be really important for long-term outcomes for rural areas in the U.S. And instead of drawing connections to the climate directly, right, I'm not a climate person per se, I wanted to offer this presentation with some kind of final thoughts to say that these two things. So we can't forge ahead with climate adaptation without considering the current plight of the remaining rural counties which exist, that never have become urban and continue to be vulnerable to climate change. And a just transition for rural America is not just a transition from one thing to another. Extraction's already left a lot of these places. It's not like we're saying to these places, you need to stop, coal mining. West Virginia coal mining is only 3% of employment and has been for decades. So it's not moving from necessarily extraction to something else. It's taking a place that has already been totally left behind and trying to give them a future. And that's that. So thank you.
Well, hello, everybody. That was a fascinating set of presentations, and thank you to all the speakers for sharing your research and insights with us. This is kind of the discussion, question and answer part of the session today, and so I guess I just want to start off by asking, just in encouraging questions from our audience and comments about the presentations that you just heard. Okay, Victor, thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the wonderful presentations. It's so challenging to really grasp what's going on and how challenging the problems we face are, but also how much we already doing on changing. Just want to go ahead with I think an easy, hopefully, question about, or comment and question about rural America. I'm interested also because I study South America, the Andes, and it's an area that faces similar challenges, rural, indigenous populations, and so on. You mentioned that one of the things that it's important in the process of helping develop and maintain and hopefully grow, if not grow, at least maintain rural towns, rural villages, rural communities, is to help them out with infrastructure, better access to conditions of life and things like that. How about research studies? Is there kind of models of how does a model of rural community look like? Incorporating technology, using local materials, facilitating the process. They're not going to do it on their own. How much is research and helping policymakers to actually have projects to maybe implement? Thank you.
Thanks for your question. I think that there's a lot of research about various models, I think, and there's a lot of ways of thinking about the issue. One way that's really popular in the U.S. is this idea of community capitals, and there's this idea as kind of a heuristic for thinking through what rural areas need to develop. So thinking about built capital, natural capital, human capital, social capital, all these other things, and thinking about and political capital, and how these things interact and reinforce one another, and how those rural areas can draw on that. I think the big issue, I think, is that, what the classic thing people say, right, is like, if you've seen one rural community, you've seen one rural community. And I think that does go a long way, where every state seems to have different models for funding. Every area has its own kind of quote-unquote competitive advantage they can draw on. You've seen a lot of communities in the U.S. try and lean into things like rural nature-based tourism and stuff like that. But there's a lot of downsides to that in terms of the jobs don't pay very well. It still is really capital intensive from kind of corporate groups that aren't internal to the area. I think that the most successful, like thinking about the model rural community you kind of referenced, I think some of the most successful ones you see are those that, for whatever reason, have had a kind of more long-term history or relationship with the sources of income in the area. So there's communities in the Northeast, for instance, where the folks who ran the factory just always decided to live in town, and that led to much better labor-capital relations. And so there are some of those, or there are communities that have really strong competitive advantages. But all of these places are still having their own problems. Even the places that initially had a lot going for them have, like, for instance, Jackson Hole, Wyoming is a great example of a place that started off and has this kind of long history, but now at this point is basically unlivable for most regular folks. So I don't have a great answer for the model rural community, because, again, the model rural communities at this point are mostly urban. The ones that were really successful back in the day are urban. And I think that is one of these big questions to grapple with, is without like really strong social policy and safety nets and stuff like that, is there a version under our current political economic structure that where rural places continue to just stay rural? So.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I kind of have a follow-up question to that, which it relates to, as we think about policy, as we think about politics, and just socioeconomic climates in these rural spaces and communities, like, where's the tipping point? Kind of what makes people want to stay in a rural community? What can we do to change that equation, if you will, that would enable more rural communities to thrive and not just kind of, it's like the depopulation is a really scary part of what's happening in these rural communities. How do we address that? How do we understand that?
So I think there's really two main dimensions, and sorry for being the only one talking if other people have thoughts. So I think there's two main dimensions that I think of, and the first would just be, you want to make a place actually desirable to live in and sustainable to live in. And there's a lot of people who want to go back home. Like, this is, if you look at the research, the classic research is everybody says they want to live in a more rural place than they currently live. That's kind of like historically been a thing in the U.S., but people don't actually want that, because that means they lose urban amenities, and people like urban amenities, right? And so, but there are people who would choose a rural lifestyle if there were jobs for them, if there were good schools for their kids, and if there were kind of basic infrastructure. Jobs has always been the biggest problem. You've had historically in the U.S. this push that college is the only viable option if you want to move up in life. But then you have people who want to move back home, and there's no job that actually pays them what their degree is worth, and they have all this student debt. So, I mean, an easy example is get rid of student debt. Maybe people will move home. I think that's a big part of it, is making it desirable. The second thing is that I think there is a very real, as areas get older, there is sometimes an actual antagonism that I think develops between the politics of older people in rural America and younger folks who have a different view. And I don't think there's an easy way to solve that one, besides just having a bunch of young people moving in and maybe changing minds or voting the other way. So I think it's probably easier to focus on the first one. And a big obvious step to that is like making sure rural areas actually have internet, not just like look like they have internet, but actually have internet.
Thanks for that thoughtful response. Other questions from our audience?
Simone, do you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to say, in response to tipping points in coastal areas like Louisiana, what people have been finding is that there's this generational effect. So there's been a slow migration inland as younger folks realize that, right, there are those lack of opportunities, jobs, but also that property values are going down, so they don't feel like there's any reason to invest in their community, and because flood risk is so great that flood insurance is cost prohibitive, and the cost of rebuilding, et cetera, is really a significant financial barrier. So younger generations are moving inland. It's sort of, somebody described it as like one city up. They're sort of going to like the next urban city, that's sort of closest to where their family's located. And it also has the effect of, those that can't relocate are, those communities are aging and are also vulnerable. A lot of folks that have mobility issues, disabilities, et cetera, are the folks that are staying in place.
Thank you so much. That's great.
I just want to add one thing that I think it's important. We have this idea that rural environment and urban environment are kind of antithetical, and I agree with what you just said. I think that they should be part of kind of the same ecosystem. And the more we spend and we invest on infrastructure in order to have rural community more involved in urban life, and the opposite, probably the better to find that balance. So communities that are satellites or have bigger center are a great way to also manage densities and find an equilibrium.
Thank you. Other questions? Angela.
I have a question for, I think, probably Rachel and Francesco to think on together, but open for anybody. Relative to climate projections and then your analysis of OKC's urban context, do we see Oklahoma and the Oklahoma City metro area as being a strategically smart place for climate migrants? Or is it, what do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think, Oklahoma City is kind of on the edge of the dry versus wet regime, and there is some research showing that the kind of western aridity is maybe migrating east a tiny bit. So if we were to get drier, then that could be a problem in terms of water supply issues, because, like a decade ago we had a pretty significant drought, and that was really stressing our people here. But it's a mid-sized city. It's not too big. And so I haven't heard talk about that, but I do have some connections in OKC, some planners, and it'd be interesting to hear if they've talked about that. Maybe they talked about that in the Adapt OKC plan. I'm not sure.
A little bit, yeah.
Do you have any thoughts? Or?
No, I just want to say that, I'm not a geographer, I'm not a demographer, but I think that there's potential to develop some strategies we're talking about a lot of climate haven for the next decades, and how Oklahoma City can play a role in comparison to other cities in the central regions. Like we talk a lot about Colorado and as the best climate haven, and I think that if we start planning and understanding that we can have a role in this conversation, we can anticipate some improvements. The thing is really to understand that there are problems here in this context, but there are also great opportunities.
One more thing, that there is talk kind of in the climate circles about the upper Midwest being potentially where people will be migrating to. So there's the counterpart for my team that's in the Michigan region. I think they're looking at some work of, what would it look like for Detroit, for example, to accept climate migrants and all that.
Great comments. There was another question over here. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talks. They were really fascinating. And this is a question for everybody. I'm wondering what the limits are to achieving some form of resilience without structural change, because underpinning all of your talks, I think, is like the spectrum. It's the spectrum of capitalism, and it's the racial capitalism and the histories of inequality that plague the U.S. and elsewhere. I mean, Angela, your work too, thinking about the way COVID has affected this country because of the private healthcare system, because of political division. So what are the limits to what we can achieve without addressing those larger economic and social questions?
I might just briefly say my one piece quick. I think I kind of suggested when I said rural America might just disappear without like social policy. I mean, you could also say rural America won't exist with more socialist policy. I think that it's at that level and point for the stuff I was talking about, where capitalism as usual will get rid of, I think, or with the exception of those very few kind of Goldilocks rural communities, what we think of as like a rural place will just disappear. But I'll let others without what you're talking about.
I think it's just based on my research, the contingent point is actually on trust, on everyone, all the people, fellow citizens, trust in government. It's really important to kind of mobilize and motivate people to increase that agency, is really coming back to that point of trust, because people don't really trust each other. They only trust people in their immediate bonding relationships. And the reason I talked about pandemic is I think pandemic is also one of the consequences. Increasing pandemic or epidemic is another consequence of climate change. And another reason is that those two studies, pandemic studies, actually reflect the most recent public mindset in terms of what people are experiencing. And the big factor of all of the pandemic study just goes back to this idea of trust in terms for communication, for kind of building infrastructure, for researchers or scientific community trying to help either rural or urban communities. I think it's rebuilding trust.
Simone?
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a really excellent question. I think that I'm thinking about just the fact that a lot of the critique of resilience discourse has to do with this idea that individuals have the onus, particularly it meshes with neoliberalization in terms of being individual risk managers. I think that the consequence is, so obviously I feel like we have to address structural issues, but the consequences like we're seeing for vulnerable folks is sort of more of the same. Like people are managing these catastrophes, but they're sort of barely managing them. And I think that like a parallel question has everything to do with the way, because a lot of vulnerable communities realize that there has to be structural change, is they're trying to understand how to engage with institutions and how to transform institutions, how to work within the state but also without the state. So there's the emergence of like mutual aid networks, and that has been really crucial for disaster recovery. So I'll just leave it there.
I just want to follow up on that also with a thought about sociocultural influences. Just as a social scientist myself, also who has studied some of the phenomena going on in social media. Social media is incredibly powerful, has become an incredibly powerful influence in our lives. I think kind of in ways and so rapidly that we haven't realized quite just what is going on. There's a lot of polarization, politicization of issues, and just divisions. We stay in these little homophilous groups on social media where we're not connecting, we're not bridging across and outside of maybe our own little comfort zones. And I wonder if anybody has thoughts on how the sociocultural landscape that we are in right now can be changed either via individuals or institutions or policy kinds of. I mean, this might take like big tech and some of these private companies to really intervene. Thoughts?
I don't have an exact answer to your question, but one that I do have is based on the work that some of the work that Skip does, where we're really getting down to local levels and having workshops and listening to needs and trying to understand, the context in which people live and work, and then taking that context and trying to relate to them. Okay, here's where you're at with understanding, for example, how climate change is affecting you, and we'll often talk about hazards and the hazards they face. And so I think meeting people where they're at to then develop those that trust could then facilitate, ever so slowly some changes in opinion. And I think, in-person conversations are so needed instead of just typing on a computer on, social media.
Yeah, this is a shared experience by all of us, this climate change, and it's something we all face.
I guess my thoughts on the social media, I don't know. I think that if you look at rural America 30 years ago, I think you could actually probably see a lot of positives that have come out of social media, particularly when we're talking about people not being able to live where they want, in near family. There's a lot of increased connection, actually, between people. And so to me, I think the big problem I see is misinformation and and the difficulties of regulating that, and the fact that there's always been misinformation. People were never as close to people as people like to think, or people like to imagine rural areas as being like everybody knows their neighbor and gets along. And that's never been the case. There's been research showing urban areas have most often had far more connection than rural areas and stuff like that. But so I do sometimes resist the kind of golden age thinking as it relates to social media. But I do think that it's unavoidable. You have to admit that right now there is more what they call effective polarization, right? Where it's less that people don't actually agree on issues, but it's that they don't like people who are labeled as the other party. That's really, I think, what people have found. There's been a lot of interesting political science discussion about what polarization actually has increased, and it's not the issue polarization as much as it is what they call effective polarization. And so I do think there's a role for holding tech companies to some standards regarding what's on their platforms, as opposed to just having them self-regulate. And I think I guess there's good and bad in my mind to be had for particularly rural use of social media. And you've studied a lot. You probably.
Yeah, I think one of the trends in the industry, social media industry, is that they're trying to self-regulate, as you said. But I think in our research, we're also seeing human factors as well. We did a global study we actually looked at teenagers and their tendency to share disinformation and misinformation. So across America and Finland, Australia, and Singapore, the top reason for teenagers, younger people, they would share misinformation knowing that that's untruthful information because they can strike up a conversation. And that's the top factor among all 4 countries. So it's not just an issue now in the U.S., but across the globe, we have this issue of misinformation. And I think a lot of times it is the nature of social media based on algorithms, but a lot of times it's also human tendencies that we kind of have to think about.
Fascinating. Other questions?
As we continue to see a trend in climate change over the years to follow, and we see more people moving from areas that are less densely populated into high-density centers and less available land for people to live on. I know that he showed a graph where the water levels are going to rise to. How do you think that will affect our ability to build trust and manage crises that will follow?
So the question is, as people move to more high-density areas, how will we build trust? And yeah,
I'll take one. I think that what I try to share in my talk is really about understanding what the physical space can do for these new communities. And there's a great room for improving some of the housing models that we build today here, and rediscuss the way how these housing models can be more integrated with opportunities for people to share spaces, share energy, share moments of conviviality. I think that this is kind of a pivotal moment also for rediscussing how we build our cities and how we design our residential areas. So I'm confident that if we keep exploring this mid-range of scale for our housing, we can try to find ways to integrate people also in existing communities. It's just to test a little bit how it's possible to keep increasing density while also respecting existing conditions.
I'll just say briefly from a social perspective, and I suppose I'm racking my brain a little bit to think of a more positive example, because I think honestly there has to be a conversation about the fact when it comes to people that are being displaced or need to relocate, that there isn't a lot of dialogue about, but a lot of times they don't have places to relocate to. So receiving communities can sometimes be unwelcoming spaces, particularly like in the case of Louisiana, for people of color. There was there's still this attempt to relocate one tribal community, and the original location that they wanted to build a new place for this community was in a majority white area, and they expressed racist views about the people coming in. So that is, something that is an issue, and I think that a starting point needs to be recognizing that there's going to be uncomfortable dialogues that we have to have about how places are going to be equipped to receive folks, and how they can be welcoming, and how we can build trust, and and all of those things. So.
And I think we're out of time almost, but can I just make one quick thing? In addition to, I think, the person-to-person trust, I would just also make a pitch for the importance of trust in institutions that needs to be established. I think that, depending on your views, of the world, some people would say that's even more important. Some people would say it's not. I think in my mind, I think that having governments that actually you feel are looking out for you and taking care of you and paying attention to your needs, and if you're a marginalized population, maybe going beyond taking care of your needs and making up for past wrongs. I think that those kind of things are, that's to me what's really essential as we move more and continue moving forward and have more people migrating because of climate, and additionally as we just continue to see urbanization. If people don't trust in the government, if they don't trust the officers of various entities, it's not gonna, I think, build resilient communities.
I know there was one more person who had his hand up, and I want to take his last question, and then we're a little over time, I'm sorry, so we might have to continue our discussion during lunch, but just one more question here.
Yeah, I said, how long are we supposed to wait? The younger people, we're talking about climate disasters, water infrastructure failing, low housing, public health is just our system. What are we supposed to do? Because democratically, we just voted on water infrastructure and it failed. What are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to fight for it, or are we supposed to trust that the institutions are going to do the work?
Great question.
Well, it doesn't seem like they're doing it now, so I don't think waiting is probably the best option. But I will say I'm often find myself at a loss as well. I guess try and be, I don't think there's good answers because it's so frustrating. We've known how to fix a lot of problems we've had for a long time, and they're still not fixed. So stuff's not working.
Yeah, even just, again, I don't have a positive answer, but even something as simple as, dealing with the tornado risk we have in our area here, some basic building codes that, adding what are called hurricane clips, hurricane straps to, strengthen the homes during construction. It's a very low-cost thing, and City of Moore did it a couple of years ago, or instituted city ordinance with the new construction. But nobody has since followed, and it's just baffling to me because it's not that big of a cost at all. But, developers come in, they say, oh, people aren't going to buy here because it's too expensive and all this stuff. And so, there's solutions that are known, and many times they aren't that expensive, and in the long run there's a huge payoff, but yet people unfortunately have such short windows of time that they focus on. If there's not immediate gratification, they typically don't want it. And so I guess as an encouraging thought, maybe it would just be, talk about these things with your friends and your colleagues and people your age to, kind of, I guess, normalize, hey, we need to make these changes now. We're going to be much better off in the long run than having to do, repeated disasters and whatnot.
this comes up often in teaching, and we try and be positive with some example from social movement history, but a lot of times social movements are characterized by very long, protracted struggles, but there are often some gains had by them. So I think there's something to be said for continuing to, more in the fight camp than in the sit and wait camp. So, but I echo the frustration.
I think this is such an important topic, and as we continue to see and build and grow more interdisciplinary research approaches, we will see a continued coming together of these social and built environment and natural environment issues, and I think that, we just have to stay hopeful. So thank you everyone so much. A great session. Thank you to our speakers.